Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. Good afternoon, everyone, or wherever you're at. Good morning, good evening. It's interesting. We now have people from all over the world besides the US, so the time zones are different. But first of all, I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and especially a thank you to Reverend Dr. Duncan Williams, who is our guest speaker this morning. I'd like to just give you a short bio. Reverend Dr. Duncan Williams was born in Tokyo, Japan, to a Japanese mother and British father, and grew up in Japan and England until the age of 17, when he came to the US to attend Reed College, and then graduate school, Harvard, where he received a PhD in religion. He is currently the professor of religion and East Asian languages and cultures, and the director of the USC Shinjo Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Culture. Previously, he held the Shinjo Ito Distinguished Chair of Japanese Buddhism at UC Berkeley. He has also been ordained since 1993 as a Buddhist priest in the Soto Zen tradition, and served as the Buddhist chaplain at Harvard University from 1994 to 1996. And as many of you know, he is the author of the very important American Sutra, A Story of Faith and Freedom in the Second World War. So today we've asked him to speak on Zen and Shinshu. So thank you, Dr. Williams, for doing this for us. And please, everyone, please listen carefully.
Reverend Yaron, thank you for such a kind introduction. And I want to thank you for hosting today. And of course, Bishop Marvin Harada for also inviting me to come to this event of the BCA Center for Buddhist Education. Koichi, Yumi, Judy, others I know behind the scenes made this gathering possible. So thank you so much. As Reverend Hirano said, today I think I was tasked to say something about what is Zen Buddhism, and also because of the context of the BCA, maybe find some way to say a few words about Zen Buddhism and its connection to Jodo Shinshu, and I hope I can get there. My hope is to present through sharing my screen. I'm going to have some visuals and some slides from a PowerPoint presentation, and I hope that that will help give a little bit more of a sense of how to, in a very short amount of time, sometimes, you know, I teach a whole semester's worth of a course called Zen Buddhism. So I'm going to try in like a very short amount of time, give you a little bit of a overview of what is the Zen Buddhist tradition. My understanding is there's another speaker who will be speaking in a similar topic. And so whatever I'm missing, I hope can be covered by the other speaker. But I will try my best to you know, on a very kind of introductory level, present a little bit about Zen Buddhism, a little bit about at least my take on what is the Zen Buddhist tradition, how does it also relate to Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, and then a little bit about myself in along the way. So I wanted to start today with one story, which I think will help to structure how I try to present material today. It's a story about a Zen teacher who some of you may know, Joshu Sasaki Roshi. He was a young man, well, 13 years old when he entered a Zen Buddhist monastery in Japan. And I mentioned this story because I think it'll give a little bit of a sense of a glimpse into this question of what is Zen Buddhism. So like many monasteries in Japan, and this is not limited to Zen monasteries, but Tendai monasteries and Shingon monasteries. Sometimes very young, people in the teens and so on enter the temple, especially in the olden days. These days, not so much. But in the olden days, it was not surprising to have some young monks, novice monks. And he was 13 years old, and a couple other young monks were entering this monastery. And the story goes that he was, in the first couple of days, he was invited to meet with the abbot of the monastery, along with two other young novice monks. And sometimes in the Zen monastery, you have these little bit formal meetings with the head teacher or the abbot, and over some tea. And so he was invited to come to the tea and meet with the Zen priest, who asked the young boys, I'm going to ask you a question, he said. How old is the Buddha? And one of the boys had studied enough to say, I think the Buddha is about 2,500 years old. And the teacher said, that's a good answer. That shows you have studied a little bit about the founding of our tradition and how long ago the founder of the Buddhist tradition kind of came into being in India. So that's a very good answer. And the second boy said, when he was asked also, how old is the Buddha? He said, the Buddha is timeless. And the Zen teacher was like, that's a very good answer too, because maybe the Buddha is not something that is constrained by what we typically consider as time. And so in the kind of idea of a cosmic Buddha or the Buddha nature, it can't be linked to a particular year or something. So he's like, that's a nice answer too. And then, poor Joshi Sosai was third. And so two very good answers had already come, and he didn't know what to say, except he was like, again asked, how old is the Buddha? And he said, the Buddha is 13. And that's when the Zen teacher said, that's a Zen answer. So what I want to do today is do a little bit of, that third answer, that the Buddha is 13, meaning that the Buddha is not separate from any one of us. And so because he was 13, the Buddha was 13. That kind of, how should we say, answer of non-separation is maybe one way we could talk about a kind of Zen style of enacting our Buddhist practice. And so I want to today do a little bit of each of the boys had a different style of talking about Buddhism, and I want to do that today. I want to do a little bit of history. I want to do a little bit of what is a Zen kind of way of thinking or approaching things, but also tell you a little bit about how some of this stuff is not some kind of abstract or academic matter, but also how we might see these things in daily life, or in my case, just I'll tell you some stories about my own experience, and hopefully that will be helpful for setting up the Q&A, which is what I'm actually looking forward to today. So yesterday when I was talking to Judy, she's like, I learn better by seeing. So visually, it'd be nice to have some presentation. So I'm going to share my screen and run this PowerPoint as a way to structure how I'm going to talk today. Now, one of the things about what is Zen Buddhism, first we have to think about what is Buddhism, because Zen is, to me, it's a lineage and a style, but it's also rooted in this much bigger project of Buddhism. And so, again, I give a whole semester-long courses on what, introduction to Buddhism. So, but what is the common ground that if we had to sum up very quickly, what is Buddhism? I always like to say, we have so many diverse traditions in the Buddhist tradition, from Tibetan to Thai to Japanese, and even inside Japanese, Nichiren Buddhism, Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, Higashonganji, Nishonganji, Soto Zen Buddhism, so many traditions. But one thing I think we have a common ground or a common understanding as fellow Buddhists is that our tradition is born from the idea that we are, the project is to alleviate suffering, or dukkha, as it was called in the Sanskrit context. The idea of our lives, shoro byoshi in Japanese, right? Being born and getting old and getting sick and dying. This is everything. It doesn't matter how rich or poor you are. Everybody, just a part of the human condition is that we have to go through some things that are uneasy, in a state of dis-ease or disease, if you have to put it that way. But that the Dharma is a kind of medicine to alleviate that. And that's a project that I think every Buddhist from every era, every sect and lineage, we can all agree on. I don't think any Buddhist out there that will say, we're here to increase suffering, that the Buddha entered his own path thinking about Shoro Byoshi, those 4 gates as he exits the palace. He's like, I want to know a way to become free from dukkha and alleviate it. So another way that I've tried to these days kind of just have a simple formula for what is Buddhism is, sometimes I say wisdom times compassion equals freedom. A kind of formula that's not that hard to remember, but that our goal is some kind of liberation. Sometimes people call it awakening, enlightenment, but it's in a way a type of release and freedom from different kinds of constraints, and that we need 2 elements to get us there. Sometimes in the Buddhist tradition, there's a metaphor of a bird needing 2 wings to fly, and that one wing is wisdom and the other wing is compassion. So wisdom, that just means like we see things clearly instead of deludedly, or we take in reality as it is, as opposed to what we wish it could be. Or so being able to see things clearly, that's a really important part of I think Buddhist life. And then one of the things I think when we see things clearly is that we see how we are not separate, not apart, but rather interlinked with each other. And so the way to act in such a vision of the world is one where we share dukkha with each other. The word compassion, if you look at the Latin of it, patho, suffering, and com means with. So you suffer together with other people. That's compassion. And so when we live with each other and we know that we all have different, difficulties, and sometimes people on the surface, they look fine and everything, but inside we have different hurts. And there's no one that can escape that. So we're together and we live a life that is respectful of that fact of interlinkedness of our lives. And that freedom is also, therefore, something that is not just a privatized matter, but something that we do together. That's why we have Sangha, right? Why our practice is better done when we are in relationship with each other. So those are the type of things that I think are at the ground of what is why the Buddha kind of went on his own path, but what the teaching tells us. And we have many, many different pathways to either getting wisdom or practicing compassion. But I think our common ground is that we are interested in helping each other alleviate suffering. And so on that ground, there's something that each lineage, whether it's Jodo Shinshu or Nichiren Buddhism or Shingon Buddhism or Zen Buddhism, we have a different, little bit different maybe style of how to handle these matters. And so if I were to go to what is the Zen part of it, the word Zen is simply the Japanese, pronunciation of the Chinese word Chan. And Chan is an abbreviation of the Chinese word Channa, which is what they call transliteration. It's like like when you have something that sounds like approximate in a different language. You're not translating it, but transliterating. You're trying to pronounce it. So there's many words in Japanese, mandala, like that's for mandala, or like there's many other Buddhist words that are transliterations as opposed to translations. And Channa was a Chinese transliteration of the Indic words in the Sanskrit dhyana, or in Pali jhana. And so, which simply means a kind of state of mind, a meditative kind of awareness. And so one way we could say what is the Zen Buddhist style is that there is a attention to becoming aware and awake, finding some kind of mindful state. And in one of the very early Pali texts, the Buddha talks about this, and I'm going to just read this passage. I recall once when my father, the Shakyan, was working, now sitting in the cool shade of the, I'm sorry, I'm going to try to move that screen. I was sitting in the cool shade of a rose apple tree, then quite secluded from sensuality, secluded from unskillful mental qualities, I entered and remained in the first jhana. Rapture and pleasure born from seclusion accompanied by direct thought and evaluation. Could that be the path to awakening? Then following on that memory came the realization, this is the path to awakening. And so you may recall that the Buddha, tried different kinds of meditative practices in the Indic context of his time. And he was having difficulty finding a pathway to awakening. And it was only when he remembered this kind of more just natural style of just sitting underneath a tree and just observing things, and the kind of mental state that he had a little hint, oh, maybe this is the pathway. And as we know, he goes through many, many things thereafter, but then he ultimately ends up under the Bodhi tree in a state that in the Zen Buddhist tradition we call zazen, or seated Zen, a kind of dhyana or a kind of mental situatedness where he folded his legs in like a cross-legged position, back was straight. He had done many things prior to this moment that is sometimes identified as like the moment of awakening, but sitting under that tree, he comes to various kinds of wisdom or insight into the nature of himself, of the nature of the world. And so in the Zen Buddhist tradition, many times we will go back to that moment or that part of the Buddha story to say, we are trying to enact with our own bodies and minds that state of sitting. And in the Japanese Soto Zen Buddhist tradition that I'm affiliated with, sometimes we call that shikantaza, or mere sitting. It's a type of sitting in meditation where you're not trying to grasp after anything or trying to get anything. It's less about trying to obtain this state or that state, or trying to, it's less a, how do you say, a functional style of meditation where like, if I can get this kind of concentration, I'm going to be able to do well on my test tomorrow. Or if I can, calm myself down enough doing this kind of meditation, I'll be able to do X. It's not about a transactional thing like that. So it's kind of like just sitting as the Buddha was sitting, because we are also, and this I'll get to more in a moment, we are also have to share the same Buddha nature. And so when we can just let go of everything else that is extra and just sit, it allows us to touch that place of being free. And so that's one style that is commonly known. I think most of you know that inside Zen monasteries and training, the practice of formal seated meditation is certainly important element, but that because our Buddha nature is with us, it's not two things. And so when we're standing, we still have it. And when we're walking, we can do walking Zen, we can do eating Zen, we can do many kinds of things with that kind of awareness and mental situation. So that's one style that I think is very important for how Zen Buddhist practice is enacted, and that kind of style comes into practice. And another style that is often talked about is the study and practice together with koan or gongan in the Chinese. The word itself comes from this longer phrase, kofu no antoku. Ko and an an come from there, and kofu no antoku simply meant back in the classical Chinese period, like a public document, but often like to be submitted to government officials by local officials and that kind of thing. But it's like a public thing that you would, for example, submit to a court or things like that. So some kind of evidence that was recorded of some kind of situation. And in this case, in the Buddhist context, this word is used to convey some kind of not private or secret, but a kind of public and official or well-known encounter between some Zen teacher and a student that embodies an important principle of the Dharma. Okay, and then so there are many texts, the Mumonkan, Hikigan, many kind of koan collections of these encounters of teacher, masters, and students, and in the Zen tradition, some lineages really focus on studying and mastering some of the cases that are classically assembled. And but ultimately in the Zen tradition, and I'll get into it more in a moment, anything can be a teaching. So when you're talking to your grandmother or walking in the garden and walking on some pebbles, the pebble can be a teacher, your grandmother can be a teacher. So anything might be an opportunity to enter the Dharma and have some kind of teaching. And so there's also koan of like, everyday living. So there's the formal ones that are good to study, but there's also many things that come from just being alive. You're going to have many things that are opportunities for deepening our learning and understanding of our life. And so I wanted to just start with that before I get into now some specifics. I'm going to use a certain number of images to help kind of talk through a few of the elements that maybe distinguish Zen Buddhist style of practicing Buddhism from Jodo Shinshu way. And a lot of things in the Zen tradition, of course, is about embodying and ritual practice and meditative practice, but it's also about stories that are important and that can guide us in many ways. And so one of the first stories about what is this style or lineage of Zen, and people will say, well, it comes from a story about how the Buddha entrusted one of his disciples. In Japanese we say Makakasho, but in Sanskrit Mahakasyapa, entrusted the Dharma to one of his many disciples that he trusted. And it's said that it's sometimes called the flower sermon, but the Buddha, in many of the classic sutras, usually it says one of the other disciples of the Buddha, Ananda, is supposed to have remembered a lot of stories of what the Buddha said to everyone, and that becomes the sutras, and that becomes our collection of canonical teachings. So he often starts, thus have I heard, and then he tries to recall who is present and what the Buddha taught and so forth. And in one of the stories, a more unusual one, the Buddha is described as being in front of all these different people to give a Dharma message. But instead of speaking, he lifts up his hand and shows a white flower. And most people are like, that's odd or confusing. Why is the Buddha not talking? But only Mahakasyapa kind of got it. And kind of, they say he had a subtle smile that of knowing, and the Buddha recognized that and said, I possess the true Dharma eye, the marvelous mind of nirvana, the true form of formlessness, the subtle Dharma gate that does not rest on words or letters, but a special transmission outside of the scriptures. This I entrust to Mahakasyapa. So this encounter between a master and a disciple was one of the first really important stories of how the Zen lineage, a lineage that doesn't, that's about some kind of transmission or some kind of teaching between a master and a student, something that didn't rely on some formalistic set of texts. This was, in this legend, entrusted to one of his disciples. And so when we, in the monastery and in many temples, the morning service, we try to recite and respect all of our Dharma ancestors. And so we have this moment in the ceremony where we chant all the names of the teachers. And we, of course, start with Shakyamuni Buddha, and then we list the next person as Mahakasyapa, and then Ananda Dayosho, like then to Ananda, and so on and so on and so forth, until we get to a person called Bodhidharma, who I'll talk about next, in India, and who is technically considered like the first patriarch or the first lineage master who transmitted this type of teaching from India to China, and is often considered the founder of the Zen Buddhist tradition. But in many ways, within the tradition, we believe that it's not just about Bodhidharma, but in fact, this bloodline or lineage of the Dharma goes all the way back to Shakyamuni. And if you see this document here, we call it Kechimyaku. When you take ordination or things like that, you will get a name, a Dharma name, and then your name will come at the very end of this long line of the people. And we try to respect our teacher and teachers teach all these people. And it goes all the way back. And if you look at the close-up, if you can read the Japanese, on the very right, it says Makakasho Dayosho, and then the next line goes Ananda Dayosho. But then above it, Shakyamuni Daiyosho, so Shakyamuni Buddha, and above Shakyamuni, emptiness. It's an enso or a Zen circle that is representing emptiness. And so this is, of course, a very important part of Mahayana Buddhist teaching, that we are, at the end of the day, are when we see things truly, we will see that all things are not stuck in some solid or permanent or autonomous form, but empty of those qualities. And we can see that kind of world of interlinkedness and interpenetration that is not about solidity and kind of separation, but all of these things are interlinked. So emptiness is very, very key part of Buddhist teaching. And so we often say our lineage goes all the way back to emptiness. And so I mentioned Bodhidharma, and I think many of you know, in the Japanese and Japanese American culture, I think the doll. Maybe most people know the dolls and less about the person behind the dolls. But there's a doll in the Japanese we call Bodhidharma Daruma, or Daruma Daishi, or Daruma. And there are certain prefectures like Gunma Prefecture, and that are famous for producing these dolls. And often you can see in this picture, people who want to get victory in like an election, or I think I just read a memoir written by Senator Mazie Hirono. She's the first Buddhist to be elected to Congress, and she talked about having one of these Daruma dolls, these round red dolls, where the only one of the eyes is filled out at the beginning of a political campaign to kind of like, how should we say, show one's determination to come to victory in this project of, I guess in this case, running for election for Congress. So she talked about that. And when she got elected, she put in the second eye. And that's a tradition that many Japanese politicians do even today. But of course, it's not just about politics, but people trying to get into from high school to college, they'll say, I'm gonna vow to study hard, and they put the first eye in, and then they'll put the second eye in when they get into the college that they were trying to get in. Or anyway, it's a very popular or common thing when you're trying to make a aspiration where you need a certain kind of determination. And this all links to, again, it's all about stories, but there's another legend of this person who took this jhana tradition, this meditative tradition from India to China. And in the process, apparently spent many years inside a cave practicing very diligently and determinedly. And the reason, and so you see in the other slide, part of the slide here, Bodhidharma facing the wall of the cave and practicing. And apparently the legend, these are just a little bit, little bit fantastical stories, but apparently he sat for so long that he kind of lost use of his legs because he was in cross-legged posture for too long, 9 years, facing the wall of a cave. And so that's why those dolls, they're supposed to be those dolls where you can, like it's round, but weighted in such a way that if you push it, it'll like fall, but then it'll kind of like get straight back up. And there's a phrase that in Japan is quite well known and attributed to Bodhidharma. Again, I say attributed and a little bit fantastic. We don't really know about the historicity of this particular person so well, but by legend, it's said that this doll was created so that it would always kind of sit back up straight because of the legend of Bodhidharma, who was so dedicated in his meditation practice and who even lost the use of his legs, but still became upright. And there's this phrase that's connected with this story. It says, "Nana korobi yaoki," 7 times falling down, 8 times you get back up. And it's a kind of, if you fall down 1,000,000 times, you get up 1,000,001 times. It's kind of the idea that in meditation practice, it's so easy, if anybody's, I know in Jodo Shinshu, maybe it's not so commonly done to practice meditation, but if you ever try to do that, sit very still and your back is kind of upright and you have a certain kind of attention and so forth, it's so easy to lose attention. Some music can come in, or you smell some food, and your mind can wander so easily. And so it's or your body, you try to be upright, and it's so for some people it's also not so easy to get into cross-legged or any kind of seated thing for too long. It's hard to stay still. The body starts revolting and getting all like spasms of muscles, or like very slothful, and you start falling asleep. So that's a very common thing for many people as they try to do the meditation practice. But the idea is like, instead of worrying too much about that those things happen, every time you kind of like your back or your mind and body is not so straight and you slumped over, you just notice it and you kind of get back up. When your mind starts wandering about lunch is coming up, then you notice, oh, okay, my mind is doing, then you come back to awareness of yourself or your breath, whatever you'd like to do in your meditation practice. But you come back to the origin point and get back straight again. So many times down, we get back up. We fall off the path many times. None of us are perfect. None of us are, but Bodhidharma kind of gave us a kind of type of example. Nobody, of course, wants to sit in a cave for, but gave us a kind of hint of the type of determination that sometimes it takes to get through some difficulties. And of course, the biggest difficulty we all face as human beings is this problem of dukkha and the problem of dis-ease, and how do we not only attend to body and mind and all the different aspects of ourselves, but all the aspects of all beings, all sentient beings who similarly experience these things. That's a huge thing that requires great kind of determination. And so one final thing I'm going to say about this is the kind of practice I'm going to come back to in a moment, a little bit later, that says you need great determination, you need great doubt, and great faith. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that hopefully later. But this idea that to do anything, worthwhile, you're going to fail a few times. You're going to fall off the path a number of times, but it's going to require that determination, get back up again. And that as you're doing that process, we question sometimes, we have to kind of dig deeper beyond the surface, and that's what's called great doubt. But like we have to kind of like allow ourselves to not be afraid to kind of go plunge a little bit deeper into the matter of things. And finally, great faith, this idea that at the end of the day, because we all have Buddha nature, there's actually nothing we have to worry so much about, that we are have enough great faith that we are in this net of life together, and there's nothing we can fall out of. And so great faith and great doubt and great determination seems like maybe they don't go together, but in the Zen style, we try to put those things in combination to do our kind of Buddhist life. And so I just wanted to read this final set of things around Bodhidharma to get at the flavor of this tradition. I mentioned the flower sermon, and it's drawing directly from that, this 4-verse thing, 4-verse poem attributed to Bodhidharma about what is, the Zen tradition. And verse 1 says, a special transmission outside the scriptures, not depending on words and letters, directly pointing to the mind, seeing into one's true nature and attaining Buddhahood. So this is the usual way it tends to get translated into English, but a kind of, how should we say, it's a type of transmission or Buddhist kind of teaching that isn't restricted to, when they say words and letters, it means like the kind of conventional terms that we tend to use. Even in the Buddhist tradition, we use words to help define different things. But this is a transmission that says it's not dependent on that. Although, quite frankly, we often have to use the words and letters to transmit things. But it's something that is not stuck on that. And because it's not stuck on that, there's something a little bit more direct that you don't have to go and be mediated through something else. But it's just being able to, how should we say, strip away all the things that are unnecessary so that we can see things clearly. And when we do, the idea is we see we're not far apart from the Buddha. We're not trying to become a Buddha, but we can kind of return to our nature, our true nature. And so that's one kind of way to talk about the tradition. And this comes in the bigger context. As I was saying at the very beginning, we shouldn't talk about Zen without talking about Buddhism, because it's one style, but it's in the ground of this much larger tradition, and especially in the kind of Mahayana or great vehicle tradition. Zen Buddhism kind of lies somewhere in the middle of two styles of ways of analyzing or viewing the world. That's very important to also keep in mind as forming the kind of structures around this tradition. And the first is the Buddhist analysis of emptiness. And this is a style that is associated with what's sometimes called Madhyamaka, or the tradition associated with Nagarjuna and so forth in India. This analysis that we had earlier, that, empty circle, right? The idea that when we look at ourselves, we can see that ourselves is, that was one of the big insights of the Buddha, right? That he said something very radical for his time. He said that the self is not permanent, and the self is not independent or autonomous, but rather interdependent. And that was a very different vision of reality than what many of the teachers of his time were saying. And in the Avatamsaka Sutra, or in Japanese, Kegonkyo, there's a beautiful vision of what's called the jewel net of Indra to talk about this kind of world, where they would talk about the world as being created of an infinite number of these beautiful jewels. Each jewel kind of polished and cut in such a way that it's like a mirror on the different facets of this jewel. And if you can imagine like a tennis court net, those little knots they have in there, it'd be as if like you'd have a tennis court net, but like instead of it being that kind of dimension, it's like expanded into every dimension, all, we call it 10 directions, but all the directions infinitely. And in each little knot, there's a jewel. And so that's sometimes called the jeweled net of Indra. But this idea that the deity Indra kind of spun this world, and the way the world was created, we ourselves are like one of these jewels in that large net. And so unlike Christian, or some kinds of styles of thinking about how the world came into being. There's an external deity that creates something called creation. This is the idea is that we are interlinked with the divine or the sacred or the ultimate because we are ourselves one of the jewels in this infinite net. And the idea is if when you look into every jewel, you'll see that it is not, because it's like a mirror, you can see that it is composed of all of the other jewels in the net. And when you look even deeper, you'll see because the other jewels are also composed of everything else, it's like a double vision of interrelatedness that is the meaning of when we say the self is empty. When we look at ourselves, we are empty of self-nature. And so that's, I mean, again, emptiness is very difficult and something we can spend weeks on, but that's one way to just, in a simple way, when we look at ourselves and we notice, oh, I have the DNA of I'm starting to bald over here, that's my dad, and you know, my eyes look a little bit like my mom, or my thinking is influenced by my brother, or you know, different things. It means that our mind and body, what we eat, what we drink, all these things are changing our cells and everything about us all the time, and that we're empty, swabhava, we're empty of the self nature, and that's one way to think about it. And so here I was just kind of highlighting one of the, you know, you can see the text there for the Heart Sutra, Kanji Zaibosa Gyojin. You can read it, and there's that, you know, these phrases that start with the word mu, mugen kaineshi mu, the kind of like all the kind of there's no eyes, no ear, no nose, no tongue, body, and no mind even. That all of our things that we think constitute ourselves is actually empty. This is one of the teachings of the Heart Sutra. But this is, I think, you know, and this is, of course, a sutra chanted every morning in the morning service. And so this is one very important context for understanding Zen Buddhism, is that it's a tradition that wants us to awaken to some of these things about how ourselves is not so solid, and ourselves are not so apart from everything else. But the other part, and sometimes, you know, we say, I call it mind construction, but Buddhism is also a tradition that's not just about negation, about there is no X or there is no Y, but it's a beautiful tradition that says, let's use our imagination, because the world is created by our consciousness. Sometimes we call it mind only or consciousness only, exemplified not by Nagarjuna and the Madhyamaka tradition, but this tradition in Buddhism called Yogachara, and kind of in Japanese, the Hosso school. The idea that because everything is empty, and yet we exist in a world where we live in a world where we use relative or constructed or dependent kind of words and concepts and so on, our minds are actually capable of creating the realities that we reside in. And so, for example, in another early text in the early scriptures, the Pratipana Samadhi Sutra, the Buddha says, this triple world is nothing but mind. Why? Because however I imagine things, that is how they appear. So we have a ability in our Buddhist lineages to draw on a very long tradition that says, yes, the world can be negated in terms of like the solidity of things and become empty, but it's also, we can use our imagination to create our world. And so that's a very powerful way of living in this world together. And so I mentioned those two things as kind of the framework for Zen Buddhist thing. I need to just stop sharing screen for 1 second so I can see what time we're at. I'm totally over time, but Is it okay if I keep talking for a few more minutes?
Absolutely, Sensei. Please do.
Okay. I'm so sorry. I just lose track of time. Wait, 1 second. I'm sorry. I'm going to share the screen again. Share. Okay. And then, okay. So I'm going to try to build this thing now from 10 oxyording pictures. This is a very classic way. If I was asked, like, oh, what do you can you explain Zen Buddhism quickly? This is one of the ways that we do it. And there is a set of 10 pictures. If you can read the 10 cows or oxes, bulls, sometimes translated, that give us a kind of like a pathway, a way to understand the Buddhist path from a Zen perspective. And there's a famous Zen teacher, a Zen teacher from the Song Dynasty who talks, writes some poetry associated with each of these pictures, which is based on a parable about a herd boy who loses his ox and is trying to discover the ox again, and in that process actually find something more deeply important, but the ox is supposed to represent his actual identity, his true self. And anyway, I'm going to go through these images using, I think these are from Kamakura period images from the Met in New York, these scrolls. And each scroll has a picture of this herd boy trying to find the ox. And in terms of the poems, let me just read them quickly. The first one says, "By the water and under the trees, there are numerous traces." This is about traces of the ox, right? "Fragrant grasses grow thickly, but did you see the ox? Even in the depths of the distant mountain forest, how could the upturned nostril ox be concealed?" So we're trying to figure out, where's this ox? And the second one says, "One aimlessly pushes the grasses aside in search. The rivers are wide, the mountains are far away, and the path becomes longer. Exhausted and dispirited, one hears only the late autumn cicadas." Sorry, my use of technology is not so good yet. So I couldn't read the last sentence. "Autumn cicadas shrilling in the maple woods." Okay, so this is kind of like, when you start your path, the Zen Buddhist path, the big koan or big question is, who am I? And sometimes when you really have to figure out who am I, and who am I, not just as like, I am the son of so and so, I am the husband of so and so, but who am I really? And you plunge into that deeply. You can't find it at first, or it's hard because there's lots of nonsense that we carry with us, and so but somewhere in the midst of that, we have a sense that we're on some kind of path. And when I was first going to become a Buddhist priest, and I showed Koichi earlier, and this is, I think, will be amusing to some of you. This is me when I was, I guess what, 22 or something, more than about 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago. I trained inside a monastery in Japan, and I was at that time very much trying to figure out this question of who am I? As Reverend Hirono mentioned, my dad is British, my mom is Japanese, and one of the first things my teacher told me was, if you're serious about practicing Buddhism, you have to forget that you're Japanese, or you have to forget that you're British, and you have to find the middle way, in between way, because that's where you're going to find yourself. And so that was a kind of my entry point of like, growing up in Japan, being of mixed heritage, and even like religiously, my mom's Buddhist family and my dad is British, so we went to an Anglican church and going to temple and church, trying to find myself. This became start of my particular Zen Buddhist practice. And I after college, I went into some monastery to try to learn some things about being a Buddhist priest and learning more about the Buddhist way of practice. And then I want to move on to next poems and next pictures. You can see in the next picture that there's a little glimpse of the, at least above the stones, the horns of the ox. And the poem reads, "A bush warbler sings upon a branch, warm sun, soft breezes, green willows on the bank. Nowhere can the ox escape to hide, but those majestic horns are difficult to draw." So you've glimpsed it, seen something about, oh, this might, oh, okay. But then even just getting the horns is hard to draw, hard to explain, hard to grasp. In the next thing, with all my energy though, I seize the ox. His will is strong, his power endless, and he cannot be tamed easily. Sometimes he charges to the high plateau, and there he stays deep in the mists. You can sometimes catch a hold, but then it's too, but then also not, And this is about, Buddhist path is not necessarily, it is an easy path in one way, but it's also just life always throws curveballs, and no one can escape, difficulty and struggle sometimes. And you struggle sometimes with your own self, And in my tradition, the founder of my lineage of Zen Buddhism, called Soto Zen Buddhism, he lived from 1200 to 1253 as a Master Dogen. He has a way to talk about struggling with when you discover who you are in the following way. There's a text that he writes called the Tenzo Kyokun. And it's literally, Tenzo means like a monastic cook, the task inside the monastery of overseeing the kitchen. And Kyokun means the guidance or the instructions. And so he wrote a thing that he believed that outside of the abbot and so on, one of the most important high-ranking positions in monastery is the head cook. Why? Because you had to nourish all of the trainee monks, not only physically, but kind of spiritually. And so the mindset that a good cook should have, it would be imbued in the food. And so he wanted to give the right instructions for that. And the typical, don't waste anything, try to use, know what's in your kitchen, these type of things, typical instructions. And there's many things that are given as guidance, but if I had to sum it up, it would be two things. One, know the inventory of your kitchen. To be a good cook is to know you have these ingredients, those ingredients, and you should know what's there. And then number two, you should cook for not just, it's not about your, I'm a great cook or something, but more like, how do you nourish other people? And so it's not about yourself, it's about uplifting and enhancing, actualizing Buddhas in training. And so you're trying to have that kind of mindset of, this is the type of practice that we do, that sometimes it's like struggling with the ox, is that we have to struggle with ourselves. We have to struggle with the ingredients in ourselves that may be a little bit, getting a little bit rotten on the edges, and so forth. And it's the message is to be, if you have only great ingredients, you can be a mediocre cook and produce something pretty decent. It's when you take an honest account and look at yourself fully, honestly, as it is, not as we wish it were, but as it is, then we notice some things are not so good. And the trick is, how can we take even the things that are not so good and still transform it into something that is helpful, will achieve the goal of Buddhism, to alleviate suffering? How can we do that? How can we help other people? How can we nourish other people? How can we enhance, actualize ourselves and other people together? So that's, I think, one way to conceive of some of those ox herding photos. And then let me move to the next ones. The next one says, one does not let go of the whip or the rope, afraid it will stray and choose the dusty mist. A well-tended ox becomes gentle, and even with no rope, will follow people by himself. And the next one, riding the bull, I leisurely wander towards home. Exotic flute melodies echo through the sunset clouds. Each beat and each tune is indescribably profound. No words are needed for those who understand music. And so after the necessary work to deal with the different ingredients in ourselves, struggling with them, then somehow naturally the ox follows, and we walk together with the ox. And recently my wife wanted me to, we're going to get a puppy, and so I've been going through like puppy training exercises, and apparently there's, oh my goodness, there's a lot of things to apparently make a puppy become gentle, don't overbite you and all this. And so yeah, I'm sure I'm going to struggle with the puppy, but hopefully if we set the parameters correctly in the beginning, then the puppy will follow. And we don't need to ride a puppy, but in this picture, it's saying, we become very natural. One of the things about Zen Buddhism, there was a famous encounter many years back in American Buddhist history when one Zen teacher was talking to Chogyam Trungpa Roshi, which is a Tibetan teacher, and they were talking about, do you go in from emptiness into form or form into emptiness? And Chogyam Trungpa, like the Tibetan centers, he was trying to say, in our monasteries and temples, at first it may be that a teacher is giving a talk, even like the Dalai Lama, like people will be gathering in thousands and then having lunch, and they're not really listening. But over time, the form will take place. People who are serious will remain. And so it starts with a kind of like a spirit of Buddhism is there, and the form will follow. And then if you ever go to Japanese Zen monastery, I guarantee this, it's a flip way around. All the meditation cushions are in a perfect row. Everything needs to be neat and tidy. Everything is about the form. You practice, you get into the cross-leg, everything straight, everything, and then it's kind of like Suzuki method violin or something. Like you do the form again and again, and over time, then you find some freedom. And you can kind of find the spirit to experiment, have imagination. But we start with form, and it gets to freedom later. This is a kind of thing, but it's kind of like you do the training, and eventually you will be able to ride the ox, no problem. So that's the kind of, I think, little bit of a style of the Zen way. Some people don't like it, but we have a lot of rules and kind of strict forms, so I'm almost getting to the end. These almost last photos or pictures. Riding on the ox, he has come home. There is no ox there, and he is at ease. Although the sun is high, he is still dreamy, the rip and rope abandoned in the thatched hut. And the next one, rip, rope, man, and ox are all non-existent. We're back to that circle, right? The blue sky being vast, no message can be heard, just as the snowflake cannot last in the flaming red furnace. After this state, one can join the ancient teachers. So coming home, there's no ox. You're just yourself and you're at ease. So this is the state where we're no longer at dis-ease, no longer feeling the dukkha in the same way. And all the things that were important to get to there, the whip and the rope and all the tricks we use in the Dharma to kind of help ourselves to walk the path, they're also kind of like released and let go. And so those are abandoned in the thatch house, not needed anymore, and kind of at ease. And then one step further, yourself also disappears. All of the whip and rope, that's also all gone, and we're one big circle. And so I tend to think of this empty circle, and I'm trying to finally connect it to some Jodo Shinshu teaching, but like Jodo Wasan has, I think, Jiririta Emman, self-benefit, other benefit is one big circle. So when we realize that we can be in our lives self-centered and greedy, and we're looking for self-benefit, and then we realize that other beings out there have their own kind of stance, and they have their own kind of needs and wants, and they have but the Buddhist way is to see that our self and other people's benefits is actually interlinked and interconnected. It is just simply one big circle, and we see that we can let go of a lot. We can let go of the whip, the rope, the man, and the ox, because we're at ease. And that's, I think, what it means to come home, to take refuge. In our, I think, Jodo, you all also chant Namu Kie Butsu, Namu Kie Ho, Namu Kie So, Namu Kie. That word Kie, to take refuge in the Dharma, Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. If you look at the characters, it's about a return. It's about coming home, finding a refuge, and settling in. And we settle in on those three treasures and refuges of our tradition. And when we do, there is a kind of no separation, and we are at ease. And so let me go to the next one. This is the formulation that tries to capture, I think, those things in a couple of sentences. It's in Zen Master Dogen's Genjo Koan. And this is, again, a kind of like encapsulation, I think, of what these ox herding paintings are saying. He says, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. So remember how we talked about the first big question should be, who am I? We're going to study the self. And that is actually the study of Buddhism, because our study of Buddhism, our study is actually not two things. But what's interesting is to study the self, we have to forget the self, meaning we have to let it go. And we let go of our preconceptions of who we think we are. And when we do that, when we forget the self, is to be actualized by the 10,000 things. And I'm going to continue and then go to the last slides. When we're actualized by the 10,000 things, your and others' body and minds drop away, right? That becomes the enso, and no trace of realization remains. And this no trace continues endlessly. Oh, sorry, I moved too fast. Okay. So the last two ox herding paintings. In returning to the fundamentals and going back to the source, I had to work so hard. Perhaps it would be better to be blind and deaf. But being in the hut, I do not see what is outside, yet the river flows tranquilly, and the flower is simply being read. And the last one, he enters the city barefoot, with chest exposed, covered in dust and ashes, smiling broadly. No need for the magical powers of the gods and immortals. Just let the dead tree bloom again. So you'd think like, well, when we started with the Kechimyaku, with the empty circle, there was the empty circle. Maybe that's where we should end. But the 10 oxygen hurting paintings go one step further. After emptiness is a flower just being red, or a river just flowing. Everything's kind of organic and natural as it is, nothing extra, And it goes even one step further. It says we can actually be dusty and barefoot, we can come actually into the world. When they talk about cities in Buddhist traditions, often like the mountain represents this kind of retreat away from the city. Dogen built Eiheiji as far away from the city of Kyoto as possible. This idea of kind of like a retreat into the natural world. But then it's saying we have to come back into the city. We have to engage ordinary life, the marketplace, commerce, politics, ordinary life, because that's where we test our Buddhist life and practice. And when we do that, we actually become like the figure in this last photo, Hote, who is, the kind of representation in Chinese Buddhist tradition of Maitreya, or the future Buddha. We're all future Buddhas, or Buddhas needing to manifest in the real world in various forms. And so I think that's how the paintings are ending. It's saying it's natural, and we bring in whatever dusty things that we may have, but with a mind that has been training. And so this is, on the one hand, a kind of arc of training, a kind of picture of what the journey of a Buddhist practice life from a Zen perspective might be. But in a way, it's also not, how should we say, sequential, or it's not really about here is point A and you get to point Z, but it's more like it's kind of like facets of our practice. And sometimes we need to go back to, who am I? It's a good question. And you're going to answer it differently. I'm 50 something now. When I was 20 as a young monk, and now, and when I'm 80 or whatever, who am I? It's a good question. We should always go back to that first circle. But let's not forget about the 10th circle too. It's about engaging with our daily life. When I'm going to say this last story and then I'll end. When I was that young monk, just before that, I was probably like 19 or 20, and I was telling my teacher I would like to become a Buddhist priest. And he looked at me quizzically, maybe the same way like the Buddha looked to Makakashira, and he was trying to test me. So he said, you say you want to become a Buddhist priest. Do you even know what that means? So it's one of those kind of Dharma questions. And it's one of those situations where you don't want to actually give an answer because you have no idea. And so you say something like, which is what I said, I don't have any idea, please tell me. So that now he has to tell me something. And so he said, well, when you become a Buddhist priest, you will have no more holidays. Then he stopped, and then he said it in English. You will have no more holidays. Usually we talk in Japanese, but he said, you have no. And then he explained, when regular people have a summer vacation, you're very busy as a Buddhist priest to do the obon, or New Year's time, you're so busy. Everybody's got holidays. Buddhist priests, we never get holidays. And he says, when you put their robes on, it means you're communicating to the outside world, how can I help you? And he said, at the temple, if you are not in the monastery, but a regular temple like his temple in Nagano Prefecture, you have temple, he had 800 families, temple members. Somebody's got a problem with their junior high school kid. There's, having real problems, and the parents doesn't know what to do. They want to ask some advice from you as a priest, and comes to the temple like 8 p.m. in the evening. You can't say, oh, I'm sorry, the temple is, closed. It's not a 9-to-5 job. So he was like, do you still want to become a Buddhist priest? And so that's when I said, yes, I'd still like to become Buddhist priest. And he said, well, in that case, you have to make every day a holiday. So that's for me had been a very important advice. It's on the one hand about, how should we say, having the mindset that even if you're very busy, if you are doing something that you're supposed to be doing in your life, then however busy it is, it won't seem so busy. In that thing, I have to work so hard, but when you return to the source, then everything's okay. It's okay. It's okay. And you can be, there's a monk called Ikkyu, very famous Rinzai monk. Ikkyu, one rest. Everything can be one big holiday. And so that's the mindset we can have. I think that's one part of what he meant. But also, the reason he said in English is holy day. In some traditions, like Friday is a holy day for Muslim, Saturday for Jewish people, Sunday for Christians. The one day a week is supposed to be kind of this holiday where you're supposed to be focused on religious life as a kind of sacred or holy day. But he's like, make every day a holy day, because there's no separation. There's no, here's a beginning of holy, this is the end. There's no beginning, no end, no traces, no beginning and no end to this practice. And so that's kind of where I have some other things to say, but I talked way over time. I'm sorry. But let me kind of conclude there, and I'm happy to take any of your questions or thoughts, and I will stop sharing screen.
Much, William Sensei. We really appreciate your seminar this morning or afternoon. Just an announcement, next week we'll be having Anton Tenke Roshi, who's a good friend of mine from the Netherlands. So we had Professor Williams talk today more on theory of Zen. Tenke Roshi runs a fairly large monastery, Zen monastery in the Netherlands. So hopefully you could join us next week for his talk. So we'll close this service with Gassho, please. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Thank you, everyone.